Remember, Ali Bey and Abdullah Bey see the film. So we don't want somebody standing up with a ringing jet phone in the middle. This first real class is very much an introductory class. It's to give you some idea of the development of archaeology, how archaeology started off. It leads us up to the first of the great discoveries that I'll really be talking about. John Freer in 1797, the discovery of the Hoxne's stone axe, which helped give the first indication that man had been on Earth for several thousands of years. So this class really is going to take you from speculation, if you like, to excavation, the origins of modern archaeology. And we really do start off in around about 400 BC. What you have to be aware of is that what we learn from the earliest written records is that mankind, scholars, have always had an interest in the origins of mankind, the origins of civilization. And this is particularly true of the ancient Greeks. The oldest surviving piece of Greek literature that we have, written by a man called Hesiod, is known as the Theogonia. You'll see it referenced in Wikipedia and other places as the Theogony. The Theogonia basically means the birth of the gods, and it was written sometime about 700 BC, so it's one of the oldest surviving pieces we have of Greek literature. What Hesiod tried to do was to give a summary of history, what had happened in the past as it was understood by the Greeks of his own time. So really it's a story of the time before writing developed. History means written records. There was no written record in Greek, as we would understand it, for this particular period. What Hesiod suggested was that the mankind and the earth had gone through a series of separate ages, periods of time. These were all before the time of written records. And he talks about the oldest of these, the Age of Gold. This was the time when the gods were at peace with each other, the gods loved mankind, people on earth drank out of gold cups, they ate off gold plates and things like this. But gradually, the people on earth began to lose respect for the gods. The gods were fighting amongst themselves. And so the gods punished the people on earth by introducing an age of silver. This was not quite so good. People on earth did not live like the gods. They had silver cups, they had silver plates, so still a pretty luxurious life in many ways. But the people on earth continued to show disrespect to the gods. And so the gods punished them by introducing an age of bronze. A time when bronze was used for drinking cups, for eating plates, for weapons and armor and things like that. It was during this period, according to Hesiod's Theogony, that we see the rise of certain rulers of different parts of what we would now call Greece. And this brings us to the age of the heroes. This is the time of the Trojan War. And this was a time when different peoples fought against each other, the Greek-speaking peoples of Greece fighting the Greek-speaking peoples of Asia Minor, Troy. And so you have this Trojan War episode, and this was a time when mankind completely lost any respect for the gods. So the gods decided to punish mankind by introducing the Age of Iron. The Age of Iron, the time when Hesiod lived, when people had weapons and tools made of iron, there was no more gold and silver around, there was no more bronze around, all things like this. What Hesiod gives us, in a sense, is a chronology, a sort of sequence of events in the past. He doesn't give us a date for any of these events, he just says that they happen in the ancient past. But it's very important to us to know about Hesiod, because this is the first indication that we have of mankind being interested in the ancient past. Well, most Greek-speaking people, didn't really have much interest in the past. They were much more interested in general philosophical discussions. Many of the Greek city-states, like Athens, had long written histories. And so any investigation of the past was considered really not that important. But there was one group of people in ancient Greece who did take an interest in the ancient past. And these were the Spartans. The Spartans you've probably heard about, the great warriors of the ancient period. All the men go off fighting, leaving the women at home. The Spartans were not interested in art, they were not interested in literature. They had no written histories. They studied the ancient remains and artifacts, objects that they could see in Sparta, around Sparta, and they used these as evidence of their ancient past, of a time before written history. And we learn that the Greek philosopher Hippias of Elis went to Sparta to try and teach them about geometry, astronomy, grammar, poetry. They weren't interested in this. They wanted him to tell them the stories of the great heroes, the men of the past, to help explain the remains they could see. And we find out from a conversation that's recorded between Hippias and Socrates, in which Hippias says, well, the Spartans have no written history. And Socrates says, well, what are they interested in? How do they know about their past? And Hippias says, they used a method of archaeologia, the study of ancient remains, from the Greek archaeos, the ancient past, and logos, to study. This is what archaeology is. It's the study of the past from its actual remains. Although we do use history a lot in archaeology, what you have to take into account here is that one or another form of man has been on Earth for 3 million years, something like that. Our oldest written histories in Mesopotamia only go back to about 3000 BC. So for much of human existence, archaeology is the only way we can learn about the past. It just so happens that the first reference we have to the use of the method of archaeologia in understanding the past dates to about the same period. A Greek politician, Thucydides of Athens, he wrote a history of the Peloponnesian War, a major war between the different states of ancient Greece, principally Sparta and Athens. He wrote this about 400 BC, so about the same time as Hippias was talking with Socrates. And this gives us our first real evidence of archaeology, archaeologia in action. Thucydides noticed that the most important, the most sacred island in the Greek-speaking world was the island of Delos. To make it a suitable home for a temple, the people of Athens cleared up all the ancient graves they could find there, so there were no dead bodies anywhere there. What they found when clearing up these graves, excavating graves, was several artifacts, objects of Carian origin and type. Now, I'll explain about Caria in a moment. Thucydides made a note of this, and he deduced from this that Delos had once upon a time been inhabited by the Carian people. There was no reference in any written history to the Carians occupying Delos. Delos was quite some distance from Caria as well. This is the island of Delos over here. Does anybody know where Caria is? I bet most of you have been to Caria at some point or another. Bodrum. Bodrum, ancient Halicarnassus, the ancient settlement of Caria over there. So this remark of Thucydides, gives us our first real example of archaeology in action. He sees that graves on Delos, more than half of them have got objects, armor, weapons, pottery of a type he can recognize as being made by the Carian people. So therefore, he comes to this conclusion. Delos must have been part of the Carian Empire at some point in the past, the unknown past. No written record, just archaeology proved that. This interest in the past continues into the Roman period, and we find, for example, a Roman poet, Lucretius, who decided one day to write an enormously long poem called De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things, on the nature of the universe. He tries to explain the universe, the natural aspects of mankind, vision, the senses, how these work, sex and reproduction, natural forces, agriculture and disease. But he also discusses the origin of mankind, the origin of civilization. And he claims from personal observation of surviving artifacts that there were several stages that man went through in development to becoming civilized mankind. He talks about the time when man used just his nails and his teeth to make things, to eat things. But he then goes on to talk about three very distinct ages: an age of stone, an age of copper or bronze, and an age of iron, which of course was his own time. Well, this interest in the origins of mankind continues right through to the Roman period. And this brings us to one of my favourite people, Pausanias. He was a Greek-speaking native of probably Lydia. Lydia is the area just inland from modern Izmir. He's almost certainly from somewhere from the western coast of Anatolia, exactly where we're not certain. He decided to write what we can recognize in many ways as the first travel guide. It's called Elias Pereinos, a description of Greece. In this, he describes from personal observation again those ancient remains and artifacts, objects that provided evidence of the time before written history. He's especially interested in the Trojan War. The story of the Trojan War, first written down in about 700 BC. So he particularly comments on the ruins of Mycenae, the home of Agamemnon, one of the heroes of the Trojan War. He also notes that you can go to a place called Nicomedia, modern Iznik. You can see the bronze sword of Agamemnon displayed in the temple there. And he says you can go to Phaselis. Phaselis, not far from Kushadasa, well, more or less in the Ephesus area, where he says you could see the bronze spear of Achilles. Now, why he's important is that he uses these objects in his argument to say that the Trojan War must have happened because you can see these things that are referred to in the Homer story of the Trojan War. The story of the Trojan War, the ancient Greeks knew that the Trojan War had taken place before their own written histories. So he's using these objects to say the Trojan War must have happened. I can see Mycenae, the home of Agamemnon. He even says that Mycenae is so small it could not possibly have supplied 1,000 warriors for the Trojan War. He could see what people said was the bronze sword of Agamemnon, the bronze spear of Achilles. So all these things, he's using this method of archaeology to say something about the ancient past. But then we come to a rather bleak period in the history of archaeology, the decline of the Roman Empire. Well, the Roman Empire, from about AD 350, entered a long period of decline, which didn't really end until 1453, the capture of Constantinople. Actually, you can say for 1470, the capture of Trabzon. During this period, Christianity, which was made an official religion of the Roman Empire in 313, it became the only legal religion in the Roman Empire. We know this happened about the year 395. With Christianity becoming dominant in people's lives, the Bible becomes essentially the only accepted source of information for the time before written history. Well, the Bible doesn't really talk very much about the Romans. It doesn't say anything about the ancient Greeks. It does say something about the Egyptians. But they developed this belief that the Bible basically gave all the information that people needed about the time before written history. The Bible more or less suggests that civilization starts off in the Middle East, in Palestine, the state of Israel, that general area. An interesting thing about the Bible that many people commented on was that right from the very beginning of the Bible, it talks about people using iron, not bronze or stone. So the Bible belongs to this period that Lucretius and Hesiod have talked about, the age of iron. What was to them the modern period? Well, the problem was, of course, with the dominance of the church in the Mediterranean world Europe, and much of the Middle East until the rise of Islam, this meant that the absolute belief in the truth of the Bible encouraged people basically not to look into the past before written history. And some Christian writers even deliberately encourage a disinterest by indicating that to try and investigate what happened before the Bible was a sin. You wouldn't go to heaven. It would be like worshipping the pagan gods or something like that. So this sort of very dramatic turn in the way people were thinking. Up to this point, right through to the Roman Empire, people are interested in the past. They are studying artifacts as evidence of the past. They can't date the past, but they know that the past is before written history. But with Christianity, the dominant religion, the Bible becomes essentially the only source of written history, the only accepted version of history throughout much of Europe and the Mediterranean world. So it's not really until we get to the Renaissance that we start to see a rediscovery of the past, a rediscovery of interest in the past, and how artifacts, objects from the past can inform us about what happened before written history. Well, you all done the Renaissance in the history of civilization courses, so I just briefly need to remind you that it was a cultural movement that began in Italy in the late 14th century. It began very much with an interest in the writers of the classical period, which meant that the writings of Lucretius, of Hesiod, of Thucydides, Pausanias were rediscovered. People could start to learn about something else outside the Bible history in that particular way. But what we also connect with the Renaissance is an interest in all things that date from the classical past. Scholars now began to go to Greece, to Rome, Athens, and places like that to study the physical remains, the Colosseum, the Parthenon. These were actual proof of the past. This was the importance of these monuments. You see, you can read something in a book, or you can experience something. If you read something in a book, let's take a Wikipedia article. Some Wikipedia articles are really dreadful. But if you don't know the subject, if you haven't experienced the subject, then you wouldn't know that. It's like driving a car. Everybody can drive a car in theory by reading a book. But actually driving a car in practice is something very different. And this was a characteristic feature of the Renaissance period. An interest in the remains from the past, because these were physical proof of what the writers said. We also see in the Renaissance the beginnings of collections and the study of classical statues, coins, different types of pottery. These are being collected and studied to a certain extent because they represent the past. They give you that physical fact of the past. This period that we know as the Renaissance then begins to establish a feeling amongst scholars that we can learn about the past from studying the actual remains. The only thing was that only the really wealthy could actually travel to Greece and Rome and Italy and Athens and study these subjects on the ground. So what we see beginning to happen during the Renaissance is that the poorer scholars basically just had to study what was in their own country. So this interest in the study of classical remains gradually changes in some countries into an interest, a general interest in the past. Artifacts, monuments, buildings as evidence of the past. This is particularly true of Europe, and especially true of places like England, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, which were on the edge of the Roman Empire or outside the Roman Empire. England, for example, Britain, had only been part of the Roman Empire for roughly 400 years. There are no great remains of the Roman period at all to be seen in England. Denmark, Norway, Sweden, completely outside the Roman Empire. And these places also, these areas and countries also had very little written history. This is especially true in England. England only really, or Britain rather, only enters the history books really with Julius Caesar in 55 BC. Julius Caesar invaded Britain, decided he didn't really like it very much, and left Britain. Britain became a part of the Roman Empire in AD 43, and it remained a part of the Roman Empire until about the year 410. But when you look at the classical writers, they say hardly anything about Britain. They don't say what happened in England really before the Roman conquest. So to try and learn about the past of England before the Roman period, scholars knew, English scholars knew that they would have to study the physical remains and the artifacts in their own country. There was also a problem in England in particular, that there's a period we call the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages represent roughly the period from AD 410, when the Romans left Britain, to about the 8th century, when Christianity became the dominant religion in Britain. A period of 400 or 500 years, for which, again, there are no written histories. So scholars in England began to realize that the only way they could learn about the past of England before the Roman period and in the Dark Ages was to examine the monuments, the buildings, the structures, the objects they could see. Some of these sites, like Stonehenge, very visible, large stones standing in the middle of a field. I'll show you a photograph later. But also throughout England, lots of barrows. Barrows, burial mounds, normally something like 5 meters high and about 20 or 30 meters across. People could see that these could not possibly be of Roman date. The Romans built wonderful buildings with lovely arches, with mosaic floors, not like the stones of Stonehenge. The Romans buried their dead in nice little stone boxes, graves in the ground. So what we find happening towards the end of the Renaissance period is scholars in England in particular, but also in Denmark and Sweden, beginning to look at the visible sites and artifacts to try and get some idea of their past. Well, all these monuments and artifacts belong to what was recognized as the distant past, the past before written history. So they were described with the Latin word as antiquus. All scholars at this time wrote in Latin, so Latin words crop up quite a lot. We would translate antiquus as antiquities. And so these scholars are known as the antiquarians, and their method of study is known as antiquarianism. The origins of archaeology really lie in antiquarianism. Well, let's look at some of these scholars and some of the important discoveries they made about the history of England, the past of England, through studying ancient remains. One thing you have to be aware of here is that this interest in countries in the past of that country, whether England, not so much Scotland, Denmark, Sweden, got a lot of royal encouragement. See, the Renaissance period, the 16th century, is when the great countries of Europe are becoming great states. France, the German states, Spain, England, Denmark, and Sweden, and so forth. So we find royal encouragement to actually go and look for these remains to try and establish what the history of these countries was before written histories exist. And this is why we find in 1533, Henry VIII, the man you all know who had 6 wives, and I can never remember their names, but it's divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. So that's the way you remember what happened to all of them. Henry VIII appointed this man, John Leland, to be the Royal Antiquarian of England. He was given a sum of money and a nice little office in Windsor Castle, and between 1543 and 1544, he travelled all over England to make a proper record of the visible antiquities. He's an antiquarian. What he was trying to do was to study these antiquities, learn about them, make a record of them, and use these antiquities as a way of reconstructing the England's past in the time before the Romans and for the time between the Romans and the 8th century, this Dark Age period. In some cases, he would just make a record of a monument. He couldn't say what it was. He didn't really know what Stonehenge was, but thought it was probably pre-Roman. He looked at lots of barrows. He thought, well, they might be pre-Roman, they might be Dark Age date, I don't know. He was able to use some of the historical evidence, the very limited historical evidence, however, to come to some conclusions about some of these monuments. So, for example, there's a large monument we know as Offa's Dyke. Offa's Dyke is basically a deep ditch with an earth bank behind it. It's obviously a form of defence of some kind. It runs all the way from the south part of Wales to the north part of Wales, dividing the country of Wales from England proper. I've put up the Welsh name of this for you because I know that not many people realise that in Britain we have 4 official languages. We have English, we have Welsh Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic, and Irish Gaelic. Now those Gaelic languages are connected. Offa's Dyke, Clwyd Offa. If you would like to hear some Welsh, Croeso I Cymru. Welcome to Wales. There you are, see? There's other words I know in Welsh, but they're rather naughty in translation. So that's how we tend to learn languages. But to come back to Leland. Leland studied Offa's Dyke. He realised that Offa's Dyke marked more or less the boundary between Wales and England. The modern boundary is slightly different, as you can see there. He could see that at some places, like Welshpool and at Kington, there were medieval churches built on top of Offa's Dyke. From this, he was able to say that Offa's Dyke, or the Dyke as he called it, must date to the Dark Ages. He then researched what histories they were, and he found a reference to a king of the Midlands area of England, a king called Offa, who built a defence between Wales and England sometime between 757 and 796. Up to the time of Leland, this was just known as the Dyke or the Ditch. After Leland's work, we know it as Offa's Dyke, and archaeology has proved that to be the correct date. English antiquarianism was further developed by this man here, William Camden. He was inspired by Leland's work to make his own record of the visible antiquities of England. He published his discoveries in Britannia in 1586. It became a bestseller. It's that thick, that wide, that high. It's written entirely in Latin. But it was a bestseller. It was a bestseller quite simply because it was the first book to give a record of the antiquities, the visible remains of the past in Britain. In this book, Camden argued for the date of some of these remains. He says that some of them must date to before the Roman period, before 55 BC. He goes on to conclude that some of these monuments, like Stonehenge, have to be pre-Roman. There is nothing in the architecture of Stonehenge which indicates Roman influence. There is nothing in the architecture of Stonehenge that indicates influence from the medieval period. So it could be Dark Age in date, but it could be pre-Roman as well. He also went to see another very famous stone circle in Britain, the one at Avebury. You can just see some of the stones. It's not as impressive as Stonehenge because you don't have stones sitting on top of each other. But some of these stones are much higher. Now, this is a modern village within Avebury, so you can get some idea of the size of these stones here. And again, he suggested that this might be pre-Roman, it could be Dark Ages, but everything suggested to him is pre-Roman. Well, in many ways, what we find with the writings of Camden is it corresponds to that transition between the Renaissance, the Age of Reason, and the Age of the Enlightenment. The Age of the Enlightenment, a cultural revolution which placed importance on the power of reason, intellectual thought, as a way of improving and securing knowledge. This is the time when we see scholars adopting an empirical approach to their work. An empirical approach, observation, experiment, see what the results are. An empirical approach demanded that all interpretations of any subject had to be provable, they had to be verifiable through demonstration. If you could not prove an interpretation or a suggestion through experiment and observation, then it was simply a hypothesis. One of the leading characters of the Age of the Enlightenment antiquarians was this man, John Aubrey, a country gentleman who owned large areas of land in Wiltshire, one of the districts to the west of London. He decided to study the antiquities of Wiltshire in an empirical way. Unfortunately, he spent so much time collecting so much material for his proposed book that nobody was prepared to publish it. It was just too big. He died in 1697. His book was only published in 1980. But his records were available. His records were kept at Cambridge University. And because they were available, other scholars could look at them and start to see or to work out what he was looking at, understanding where antiquities were to be found. And it was this interest in the results of John Aubrey's work that led to the creation of the Society of Antiquities, should be antiquaries, in London in 1718. This was the first ever academic society, group of people who sat down with the decision, with the determination to study antiquities, to try and recover information about the past. At first, they were more interested in coins and statues and pottery and inscriptions. But some of the fellows of the Society of Antiquaries did argue that what we need to do is look at the evidence for the past of England before the Roman period and the Dark Ages. And one of these people was William Stukeley, who was the first scientific antiquarian. He published his Itinerarium Curiosum in 1724, but much more importantly, he used empirical observation to date some of the sites he looked at. One of these sites is a 40-metre high artificial hill we know as Silbury Hill. This is his drawing of it, and in his book he draws attention to the fact that this Roman road curves to go around Silbury Hill, which showed that Silbury Hill had to be pre-Roman. Well, this is what Silbury Hill looks like. And before any of you ask me, what is Silbury Hill, we still don't know. It's 40 metres high. People have excavated tunnels inside it. There doesn't seem to be a burial inside it, but we really don't know what it's for. But the important thing is this. You can see the modern road there, and in this aerial view, you can see more clearly the point that Stukeley was making. This is the Roman road, roughly. Now, the Roman road goes in a straight line. And the Romans would always use a prominent hill to line the road up. And what Stukely saw was that the Roman road comes towards Silbury Hill and then it curves around it. So it had to be pre-Roman in date. He did the same sort of investigation at a group of these barrows on Oakley Down in England. Barrows, remember, are burial mounds. Here again, he was able to follow the course of a Roman road. You can see the ditch around these barrows. He could see that the Roman road cut across the ditch of the barrow, which again meant that these are what they looked like at ground level, which again meant that they had to be pre-Roman in date. So the work of Stukely emphasizing observation, description, drawing, planning, to try and establish the date of something. Only a short step from that to the idea of let's dig into it to find out what the date is. But of course, people have been digging into ancient times from time immemorial. Burial mounds like the barrows were being dug into if they had treasure in. Ancient sites were being dug into for looking for treasure. But what we begin to see in this 18th century is the idea of excavation. You can excavate, you can dig into a site, and that way you can recover artifacts from it which might indicate its date. So we come to the ancestor in some ways of modern archaeology, a man called Brian Fawcett. He's the first real antiquarian to systematically excavate archaeological sites to try and establish their origin, their date. At the time he was working, most people thought that all the barrows in England were of pre-Roman date. But some people thought they might be of Dark Age date. So Fawcett decides to test this hypothesis. He lives in an area we call Kent, on the southeast part of England. He dug over 670 barrows in a remarkably short period, in about 10-year period. Modern archaeologists would spend a year excavating one. But he just wanted to get inside the barrows, to find the burials, to find the artifact, to try and find out if they were pre-Roman or Dark Age in date. Well, most of the ones he excavated produced artifacts made of iron. Iron weapons, iron tools, that sort of thing. And at this time, it was believed that the Romans introduced iron to England, that there was no iron in England, used in England, before the Roman period. So what this indicated to Fawcett was that the barrows, most of the barrows he excavated, had to be of Roman or later date. But none of them contained any identifiable Roman pottery. So he concluded that they must belong to the Dark Ages and specifically to the Anglo-Saxon period. But he also saw that some of the barrows he excavated had tools and weapons made of stone or bronze. So they might be pre-Roman. He was a little bit uncertain. He was also a little bit unfortunate for him because the area he was digging, Kent, was the area where the first Anglo-Saxons settled in England, so most of the barrows really are Anglo-Saxon in that area. So he never actually published his results, but shortly after he died, this man, James Douglas, who had joined the British Army, was given the responsibility for building some military defences in Kent. We know that he visited Constantinople in 1772. He was sent there on a diplomatic mission, and apparently he made some dreadful mistake because he wrote in his diary, "As I left Topkapi Sarai, looking at the gate where the heads of executed criminals used to be displayed, I could see my own head there if I didn't escape quickly." So he made some big diplomatic mistake. We don't know what it was. But he joined the British Army in 1779, so just 2 or 3 years after Fawcett had died. He was made responsible for military defences in Kent, and this gave him the chance to excavate over 100 barrows in an attempt to prove or disprove Fawcett's belief that most of them were Anglo-Saxon in date. Well, like Fawcett, he discovered that some barrows had iron objects in them, no Roman pottery, so they were Anglo-Saxon in date, but others had stone or bronze objects in them. So he's beginning to make this very important step. He's following on from Fawcett. He's identifying some burials that must belong to the pre-Roman period and other burials that must belong to the Dark Ages. Now, his method of excavation were not wonderful by modern standards. I love this particular drawing which he did, which he published in one of his books, and here you see Mr. Douglas himself. He's making fun of himself, looks, and he's holding a magnifying glass looking at the skull of somebody there, and somebody else is looking at a bronze pan, and there's the poor real archaeologist, the actual digger there, and another one here with their shovel. But the thing about Douglas is that he is making an attempt to test a hypothesis. The hypothesis or idea put forward by Fawcett that most of the barrows are Anglo-Saxon in date. Stukely said that some of them had to be pre-Roman in date. Some of the barrows that Fawcett excavated and that Douglas excavated didn't have iron in them, so they logically had to be pre-Roman in date. Well, his first publication was a dissertation on the antiquity of the earth. Douglas became a priest after he left the British Army. And this particular book of his, Dissertation on the Antiquity of the Earth, is an attempt at proving the truth of the Bible, but the story of the creation. But in this, he does describe one of his barrow excavations in Kent. He compares his finds with the material Fawcett found in his barrow excavations. This was the first attempt at, if you like, classifying and comparing material from different sites to try and get an overall picture. He argued from the similarities of the material he found in one of his barrows to what Fawcett had been found that they must belong to the same general period. Then he started work on what was really his major work, and it really is a major work in the history of archaeology. The Nenia Britannica. Nenia means a funeral song, a song that's sung when you're burying somebody. The full title, Britannica of Britain, the full title is, or a sepulchral history, a history of graves, of Great Britain from the earliest period to its general conversion to Christianity. And like all these wonderful book titles of the 18th and 19th century, it goes on and goes on and goes on and goes on, to which are added blah, 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 blah. By this time, he was the official priest to the Prince of Wales of England. What's interesting is he says, I'm a fellow of the Antiquarian Society, and he puts that above the honour of being priest to the Prince of Wales. So he had his priorities right. Much more important to be a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries. The Nenia Britannica is greatly important because in this he described his own excavations in Kent, and he compared the results of his work with the results of barrows excavated elsewhere in Britain by other people. So it's the first systematic analysis of burial customs, burial practices in pre-Roman and Anglo-Saxon England, as shown by excavation. It also has the first proper archaeological plans of an excavation. Douglas concludes in the Nenia his analysis by saying that some barrows are clearly of Anglo-Saxon date, but others have to be pre-Roman. And he includes a great series of illustrations. So, for example, this is the first plan we have in archaeology of an excavation. It's the excavation of an Anglo-Saxon grave with an iron sword there, a characteristic Anglo-Saxon knife there, part of a shield there. It's the first real illustration we have of an excavation. And throughout the Nenia, he then provides drawn examples of artifacts which he had found in barrows, that other people had found in barrows, so that other scholars could look at his book and say, I've got something like this, it must be the same date. So here, for example, we have a drawing of a collection of Anglo-Saxon objects, Anglo-Saxon brooch like that, and also, of course, drawings of Roman pottery like this. The Nenia Britannica, then, is a very, very important work. It's the first real synthesis, the first real examination of a group of ancient sites to try and recover something about the story of the past, archaeology. The story of the past for which there was no real written history. In many ways, we can claim James Douglas as the first of the modern archaeologists. He excavated and recorded his barrows in a very careful manner. He made a proper drawn record of everything he found. He used his own discoveries and compared these with other discoveries to start developing a story, to identify those barrows that were pre-Roman in date, those that were Anglo-Saxon in date. And in this particular way, I like to look on James Douglas as not only probably the first real modern archaeologist, but the first of the great discoverers, because he's the first person who discovers the past of England. Okay, I'll stop there, and we will meet again in our next class on John Freer, 1797. Right, don't forget to sign the register.